All right, Jajabor, this is Nick. Hey, great video. It's very very interesting that several of your videos lately, you you did a really interesting thing. You reversed the question. You know, for instance, in this case, you said, well, what if instead of asking, um, can something come from nothing or nothing come from something? What about if it already exists? You know, can something become nothing in the future? It's very interesting. You've done that a couple of times. That turned the question over. Very interesting. Excellent technique. This is interesting because I'm curious to see what kind of responses you might get, what counter arguments you might get. Because what you're saying to me, the core of what you're saying to me, is of the argument is basically what I remember to be, if I'm remembering correctly, the first law of thermodynamics that energy is neither created nor destroyed; it simply changes form. You know, and the spoon floating in space and not being acted on by outside external factors, it may change due to internal change. Um, but then the underlying matter persists. And of course, that may be changing too. But I think what we really have is the change of form, going on. So even if things change, I mean, something will be there. The spoon doesn't necessarily is not necessarily going to disappear from existence, though it may change form, and all its pieces may change form, and all its constituent matter may change form. There will be something there. Who knows what it will look like in 10 trillion years? That's kind of an interesting question. Um, um, I think you're right about our limited. Obviously, you're right about our being limited creatures, and we tend to project out on the world. We have a beginning. Most of the things, well, everything we see, or most things we see, have a beginning and an end. So we tend to think that the universe itself must have an end. But here, I think we make a kind of a logical error. Um, as far as we know, everything we observe within the universe has a beginning and appears to be tending towards some end. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the universe itself has a beginning and is necessarily tending toward an end, or necessarily has a beginning. The question really is, if you have a system, do the rules within the system necessarily apply to the system as a whole? And I don't think there's a necessity that the greater system must obey the same or follow or what have you, but that the system as a whole must obey the same rules for the parts of the system. That those once you're in the system, the parts of the system must necessarily follow those rules, but the system itself would not necessarily have to follow those rules. I've been trying to think of an example. Um, a good concrete example, but I haven't come up with a concrete example. I've come up with some very abstract ones that don't really apply, because if we're limiting our discussion to the physical universe, I don't have another system to compare it to, and every system I come up with is part of a system within a system within a system. But also I was thinking that change is motion. And the old Greek saying that nothing is constant but change, or change is the only constant, has always appealed to me. And I think I spoke in comments to another one of your videos, in a video about motion. A change. If you reduce change down to, what's the core element of change, it appears to be some form of motion. And Aristotle had the argument, which the argument of the prime mover, that basically cause and effect. These are all motions, but every cause has an effect, or every motion has an effect. And so if you go backwards, if you stand in the middle, or wherever the middle is, if there is a middle, which I guess not if there's infinite line, but if you stand at any point and look back, you see that okay, something caused this, caused that, caused this, caused that. Now, he said there had to be a first cause, and of course we're tempted to do this because we can trace our quote unquote cause to our parents, though that's a whole other question as to what's changing and multiplying. But our egos tell us that that's when we started, in any event, the infinite regression backwards to where you never get a first thing that initially caused the motion, uh, to some extent is unsatisfying to our minds. But I've asked myself several times, well, why can't it be? Why can't there just always have been motion? But I never took the step you did to look forward and say, well, if I look forward and a motion causes another motion, causes another motion, causes another motion, must that necessarily stop? And this is where I like the technique you used, because I immediately think, well, no, it doesn't necessarily have to stop. So then your question, well, if it doesn't necessarily have to stop, why did it necessarily have to begin? Um, and again, I think this is because we think of movement and change as a thrusting forward, you know. And for some reason, we don't necessarily expect that things have to come to an end. We just think, okay, that'll just continue. But when we turn backwards, we're kind of going up the flow events or something. Maybe we feel that there's some sort of resistance to that. Okay, this just popped into my head. I don't know. Maybe feel like we're going upstream in events, and there's a sort of a natural resistant, like salmon's running up current, and so eventually that resistance will overcome us, and we'll settle down on one thing that finally started things. Sorry about that digression. Just thinking of salmon swimming upstream when we think of past causes, but I think you ask a very valid question. If I think of a system, an example of a system that doesn't have to obey the same rules as pertain to the internals of the system, I'll let you know. But I don't think it's necessitated that it does. I think a system can have different rules, and so a system where everything is perishable, where things have a beginning and an end, itself, the system as a whole, doesn't need to have a beginning or an end. Not necessarily. Whether it does or not is another question. In reality, or in physical reality, whether it does or not, that's another question. Um, um, Skipping to the platonic level, and this is where Brain Outie will come and get me. Hey, Brain Outie, you're going to come and get me on the platonic level. As far as systems things, I was thinking first of games. Of course, a game is not a system; it's a set of rules. Uh, so it's not the same as a physical system that you know has physical parts, but you know, the game of chess, for instance, which is a system of rules, not a system of things, but the things that you use to play the game of chess, there are rules for every movement, and just like there are rules in the universe, a bishop can go here, and a king can go, and a queen can go there, and so that's how that system works. But the game of chess itself does not have to do that. Does not have to obey any of those laws. In fact, it's a set of rules, and it's sort of timeless and unchanging. But again, this is not a correct comparison, because I'm comparing an abstract set of rules rather than a living physical system. So there's not a direct correspondence between that, but it was one of the things I came up with while struggling to come up with a system where the system as a whole would not necessarily have to obey the rules that existed inherently in the parts of the system, whatever that is. Um, um, the Big Bang, very interesting. Who knows whether we have kind of a rhythmical thing going, and a flash of light, and then flash of light, flash of light. I don't know. I don't know how it works. Like I say, when I get to the point where time, it's interesting if time is part of the universe too. Well, it's interesting if time is part of the universe too. It doesn't necessarily mean that. Well, anyway, I'm not going to follow that train of thought, because burned out there on that one. We're living, we ourselves as living creatures live in a world of dependencies. We're dependent on food, we're dependent on water, we're dependent on each other, we're dependent on society, we're dependent, and life is all a system of dependencies. But other things in the world are not. Other things in the universe are not part of a system of dependencies. A planet going around is not necessarily dependent. A galaxy is not necessarily dependent on anything else. But I think we project our dependencies out and say, well, you know, there must be something that the universe depends on. And it's not necessarily so. I mean, there are things in our universe that don't depend on anything, that are independent, like huge isolated galaxies. So why should the universe as a whole have a dependency? But we as life forms because we are dependent on food and water, etc., to survive. Um, we tend to think in terms of dependencies, but there's no necessity that the universe as a whole be dependent on anything, I don't think. That's our own projection. As predators, predators in nature, which must be smart because we have to predict how our prey will behave. And in having to predict how our prey will behave, we have to come up with best ways to move, and maybe that is where consciousness arises from. How's that? There's a naturalistic explanation of consciousness as something which predators have. And maybe some of those carnivorous plants. Okay, I'm out of time. I'll talk to you later. Good video. Bye bye.